In a remote French village, far from the gaze of tourists, there was a church, a structure as ancient as the cobblestones leading up to it. Its towering spire cast a shadow over the village square, and its thick stone walls seemed to whisper secrets from another time. For generations, the locals had spoken in hushed tones about the inexplicable events that took place within those sacred halls. It was said that every year, without fail, a nun residing in the church gave birth to twins. The village, deeply devout, didn't question this apparent contradiction. Instead, they saw it as a miraculous sign, a divine gift bestowed upon their humble community. The nuns, bound by vows of chastity and seclusion, raised no alarm about these births, and the clergy, revered figures of authority, declared it the work of God's mysterious hand. Yet something about the story never sat right. A sense of unease simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing year. The villagers grew accustomed to treating the twins as blessings, but a few couldn't help but wonder, why this church? Why these nuns? And why twins, always twins? One evening, as the bells tolled a haunting melody, a young nun named Sophia arrived at the church. She had heard the rumors, of course, everyone had. But unlike the others, she wasn't willing to accept the mystery at face value. Something felt off, as if the truth was waiting to be unearthed, hidden in the shadows of the ancient stone walls. With each step inside the church, she felt the air grow heavier, more charged, as if the building itself was alive and watching. Sophia had come seeking answers, and she wasn't leaving until she found them. The first time the twins were presented, the villagers gathered around the church in stunned silence. The senior clergy stood at the entrance, holding the infants aloft as though they were relics, their cries mingling with the toll of the church bell. The crowd watched, breathless. How could such children exist here in this holy place where no man had ever crossed the threshold? The church's leaders proclaimed it a miracle. These twins, they said, were divine gifts, symbols of the village's purity and faith. The villagers, yearning for something extraordinary, believed it. They whispered of blessings and signs. They flocked to the church every week to catch a glimpse of the children, bringing offerings of flowers and food, their faces alight with reverence. But Sophia, standing at the edge of the crowd, her hood pulled low, watched all this with a growing sense of unease. Something didn't fit. The nuns who supposedly bore these twins never appeared, never spoke. The senior clergy gave cryptic answers to every question, brushing aside any hint of doubt. The villagers were too overawed to press them, their curiosity dulled by the promise of divine favor. But Sophia saw the cracks, the way the clergy's smiles never quite reached their eyes. And then there were the twins themselves, always perfectly dressed, always presented together. They never aged as quickly as they should, as if time slowed in the shadow of the church. Sophia's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of what she'd seen. Were the twins truly sacred, as the clergy claimed? Or was there something darker hiding behind the altar, something that turned wonder into unease? The questions burned within her, drawing her back to the church, determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Sophia's doubts grew with each passing day. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the so-called miracles were not what they seemed. The village was content to believe what they were told, enchanted by the church's facade of holiness. But Sophia's curiosity was like a stone in her shoe, small but unrelenting. On a quiet morning, she made her way to the church under the guise of offering prayers. The massive oak doors creaked open, revealing the cool, dim interior. Candles flickered along the stone walls, their flames casting distorted shadows. Sophia knelt in a pew, her hands clasped in prayer. But her mind wasn't focused on faith. It was racing through questions, searching for clues. The senior clergy, robed and somber, passed by her as they prepared for the day's services. They moved with a certain heaviness, their eyes avoiding contact, their conversations carried out in whispers. She watched carefully, taking note of every detail. The way they lingered near the altar, the glances they exchanged, the door at the back of the church that always remained locked. Sophia waited until the congregation had dispersed and the clergy retreated to their private quarters. The church fell into silence. Alone now, she stood and made her way toward the mysterious door. Her heart pounded as she pressed her ear to the wood, straining to hear any sound from within. Nothing. She tried the handle, but it didn't budge. The lock was firm, old, and unyielding. She backed away, frustrated but determined. If the answers were hidden here, she would find another way to uncover them. Sophia began speaking discreetly with the villagers, asking about the church's history and the clergy's past. Most brushed off her questions, their trust in the church too deep to be shaken. But one elderly woman, her hands trembling as she handed Sophia a small, worn book, whispered, "Not all miracles are blessings." The book was filled with faded writings, journal entries from a nun who had served in the church decades before. The entries spoke of strange rituals conducted in secret, of nuns who vanished, and of children who were offered to ensure the village's continued prosperity. Sophia's blood ran cold as she read the words by candlelight. The so-called miracles were no act of divine grace. The truth was darker, and as she turned the last page, she knew she couldn't turn back now. Sophia knew that any direct confrontation with the clergy could put her in danger, but she couldn't let the mystery go. Armed with the journal's cryptic entries and her growing unease, she returned to the church, determined to pose as a new initiate. If she could infiltrate their ranks, perhaps she could unravel the truth from the inside. She approached the senior clergy with humility and a carefully crafted story. She claimed to have come from a distant village, feeling a divine calling to serve. Her demeanor was calm, her words reverent, and she carefully concealed her true intentions. The head priest, a man whose authority seemed carved into his very posture, regarded her with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. He agreed to let her stay, and within days, she was living inside the church, working alongside the nuns. At first, life as a novice seemed straightforward, silent prayers, long hours of service, and a rigid daily routine. But as time passed, Sophia began to notice the small oddities. The nuns spoke in hushed tones when the clergy weren't around. Their eyes carried a weight, as if burdened by a secret they could never voice. And then there were the twins, beautiful, serene, and unsettling. Their presence seemed to cast a strange spell over the place, making Sophia feel as though the air grew heavier whenever they were near. Sophia spent her nights reading through the journal and her days carefully observing the inner workings of the church. She befriended the younger nuns, earning their trust slowly. In whispered conversations after evening prayers, one of them confessed, "There's more to those twins than they say. No one knows where they came from. No one has ever seen their mother." When Sophia pressed for more, the nun grew frightened and clammed up. The fear was palpable. Someone was ensuring their silence. The head priest's watchful gaze seemed to follow Sophia everywhere, his presence looming even when he wasn't in the room. The tension inside the church grew thicker by the day. Sophia knew she was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one careless question, and she could find herself in real danger. But even as the threat loomed, she couldn't stop digging. Something dark and powerful lay beneath the surface of this place, and she was closer than ever to uncovering it. Sophia had been inside the church for weeks now, moving carefully through its shadowy corridors, learning its routines, and steadily piecing together its secrets. She had become adept at blending in, praying silently, fulfilling her duties, never raising suspicion. But the one question that remained unanswered, the question that haunted her every waking moment, was simple. Who were the mothers of these twins? No one, not even the most devout villagers, had ever claimed to have seen them. Late one evening, when the church was quiet and the candles were burning low, Sophia followed a hunch. She had noticed that certain doors remained closed at all times, watched over by the elder clergy with a vigilance that bordered on paranoia. One particular door caught her attention. Tucked away at the end of a long corridor, it was reinforced with heavy iron hinges and seemed older than the rest of the building. She had seen the head priest disappear behind it more than once, always emerging with a stern expression and a hurried pace. Sophia waited for the opportune moment. After the evening prayer, when the clergy retreated to their quarters and the church settled into silence, she made her move. Her heart pounded as she approached the door. It was locked as expected, but she had overheard the faint jingle of keys when one of the clergy had carelessly hung his robe near the kitchen. She had taken the risk to retrieve them, and now she stood before the door, fumbling through the ring of ancient keys until one finally clicked. The room beyond was cold, damp, and sparsely lit. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. Sophia's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she saw them. 3 women sitting on wooden benches, their hands folded in their laps, their faces pale and gaunt. They wore the nuns' traditional habits, but their expressions were vacant, as if life had been drained from them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the women turned her head toward Sophia. Her eyes, deep-set and filled with a haunting emptiness, met Sophia's. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to help," Sophia replied, though she wasn't certain yet how she could. "I need to understand. Are you the mothers of the twins?" The woman looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were raw, her fingers trembling. "We don't know how it started," she said slowly. "We came here to serve, to live in God's light, but they took something from us. Each of us." Sophia's blood ran cold. She crouched beside the woman, her mind racing. "Who took something from you?" she pressed. "The clergy?" The woman nodded weakly, tears welling up in her hollow eyes. "They said it was a blessing, that we would bring forth miracles. But we never agreed to this. We didn't even know." Sophia reached out, gripping the woman's hands. "I'll find a way to stop this," she whispered. "I'll make this right." Before she could ask another question, a creak echoed behind her. The door she had unlocked was now open. A shadow fell across the room. Sophia turned, her heart seizing in her chest. It was one of the senior clergy, and he did not look pleased. Sophia froze, her heart hammering as the shadow moved closer. The senior cleric stepped into the dim light, his expression cold, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low but laced with menace. For a moment, Sophia didn't know how to respond, but then one of the seated women whispered, "Please don't let them take us back." Her plea, quiet and broken, snapped Sophia's resolve into focus. "I'm here to help them," she said firmly, standing her ground. "You can't keep them locked away like this." The cleric's lip curled into a sneer. "You don't understand what you're meddling in, child. This is God's work. We do what we must to preserve his blessings." Sophia stepped closer to the women, shielding them as best she could. "What you're doing isn't divine. It's cruel. These women are suffering, and you call it a miracle." The cleric's gaze darkened. He reached for the heavy door, pulling it shut with an ominous clang that echoed through the stone chamber. The air grew colder, the small room's faint candlelight flickering as though the shadows themselves were alive. "You've seen too much," the cleric said. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down Sophia's spine. "But no one will believe you. Not the villagers, not the church. Your word against ours. You won't stand a chance." Sophia clenched her fists, her mind racing. He was right in one sense. The villagers were too devout, too trusting. But she couldn't let fear stop her now. She had to find another way. "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. "I'll make sure the truth comes out." The cleric's expression hardened, but instead of lashing out, he turned and walked away, his robes rustling as he disappeared into the darkness. The women huddled together, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Sophia knew she didn't have much time. She had to act fast before the cleric returned with reinforcements, or worse. The truth was buried deep, but now she had faces, voices, and stories to back it up. The weight of her discovery pressed heavily on her, but it also fueled her determination. Whatever dark force had rooted itself in this ancient church, she was prepared to uproot it at any cost. Sophia couldn't shake the fear that lingered after her confrontation with the cleric. But as the hours passed, her determination solidified. She needed proof, something undeniable that would expose the horrors taking place within these walls. The women's haunting confessions had lit the fuse. Now she had to find the powder keg. Late that night, when the church was silent and shrouded in darkness, she crept through the halls. Every step echoed faintly, her pulse quickening as she neared the stone staircase that led to the basement chambers. This was the one place she hadn't been able to access, the place whispered about by the younger nuns in half-finished sentences before they fell silent in fear. Sophia descended slowly, each step colder than the last. The air was thick, heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her stomach twist. At the bottom of the stairs, a faint flicker of light seeped through the edges of an old wooden door. She pressed her ear to it, and a muffled chant reached her, low, rhythmic, and unlike anything she'd heard before. Steeling herself, she eased the door open just enough to see. What lay beyond made her breath catch. The room was filled with nuns, bound and frightened, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight. Around them, senior clergy stood in a circle, their voices rising and falling in a chilling chant. The atmosphere was suffocating, oppressive. Sophia's instinct was to rush in, to scream, to stop whatever was happening, but she knew better. She needed to understand what was taking place here before she could act. Quietly, she withdrew, her mind racing. She had uncovered the darkest secret of all, and she knew now that exposing it would come at great risk. Sophia knew she couldn't act on emotion alone. The horrors she'd witnessed in that candlelit basement were undeniable, but they weren't enough. She needed proof, something concrete that could withstand the church's inevitable denials and the villagers' blind faith. Without it, the truth would remain buried in shadows. Over the next few days, Sophia began carefully documenting everything she saw. She carried a small camera concealed beneath her robes, snapping photos of the unsettling rituals, the bound nuns, the cryptic symbols etched into the basement walls. Every chance she got, she wrote detailed notes, hiding them in a hollowed-out hymnal. Each piece of evidence was a puzzle piece, slowly forming a damning picture. But gathering evidence wasn't easy. The clergy watched her closely, their sharp eyes following her every move. The other nuns, too frightened to speak openly, only offered vague, hesitant whispers. "Be careful," one of them murmured late one night as they scrubbed the stone floor together. "They know more than they let on. If they find out what you're doing—" She trailed off, her fear saying what her words couldn't. Sophia worked quickly, aware that her time was running out. The head priest's demeanor had changed. His once passive smile had hardened into something sharper, more menacing. She could feel the walls closing in, but she refused to stop. At night, she prayed, not for forgiveness, but for strength. She was walking a dangerous line, but she had to believe it was worth it. Each photo, each note brought her closer to the moment when she could take this evidence to someone who would listen, someone who could help her tear down the facade and reveal the truth. And when that moment came, Sophia vowed, There would be no going back. Sophia's evidence was meticulous. Photos of bound nuns, recordings of the eerie chants, notes detailing the secret ceremonies. But she knew that exposing these horrors required more than just documentation. It demanded courage, and it demanded a witness who could no longer deny the truth. One stormy evening, Sophia gathered her most trusted villagers, the few who had once doubted the church's divine claims, and whispered their suspicions in hushed tones. In a small room lit by a single oil lamp, she laid out the evidence on a rough wooden table. The flickering light cast long shadows over the photographs, making the grotesque scenes all the more real. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as each new piece of evidence was unveiled. The faces of the gathered villagers turned from disbelief to horror. "They told us it was a miracle," Sophia began, her voice steady but cold. "They said these twins were blessings, that we should pray and give thanks. But you've all seen the women who disappeared. You've felt the tension in the air, the unspoken fears. This is what they were hiding." One of the villagers, an elderly woman with trembling hands, pointed to a photograph of the basement. "Those poor girls," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I knew something wasn't right. I knew it." Sophia nodded. "It wasn't right. It was never right. And now we can't let it continue. This church, this institution, used faith as a shield, as a way to silence us. But we won't be silent anymore." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces lined with doubt and determination. It wasn't easy to turn against something they had trusted for generations. But as Sophia spoke, their resolve grew. She told them everything she had seen, every detail of the sinister rituals that had been disguised as sacred acts. The truth was undeniable, and with each revelation, their outrage deepened. By the end of the night, the village was no longer united by faith, but by the desire to confront the deception that had poisoned their lives. Sophia had pulled back the veil, and now it was up to them to act. Word spread quickly through the village, carried on the whispers of those who had seen the proof with their own eyes. Sophia's evidence left no room for doubt. The once revered clergy, whose words had been gospel, now stood accused of unspeakable crimes. It was as though the foundation of the village itself had cracked open, revealing something rotten at its core. When the authorities finally arrived, they moved with swift precision. Police officers, some reluctant to disturb such a long-standing institution, entered the church armed with the evidence Sophia had provided. The clerics who had long walked through the village with pride were now led out in chains. They protested, invoking their faith, claiming persecution, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. The proof was overwhelming. As the crowd gathered outside, the villagers stood in silence, watching the stained glass windows glow faintly in the fading sunlight. The church that had once been their sanctuary was now a monument to betrayal. Sophia, standing at the back, felt a strange mix of emotions. She had done what was right, what was necessary. But the sight of the old stone building, now a symbol of so much pain, weighed heavily on her. The church doors were sealed shut that evening. No one would enter again. Over the following weeks, villagers debated what to do with the structure. Some called for its complete demolition. Others wanted to preserve it as a grim reminder. In the end, it was left abandoned. The bells that once rang out so proudly now hung silent, rusted in place. Vines began to creep up the walls, nature reclaiming the space. Sophia tried to move on, but the memories lingered. The faces of the women she had saved, the haunted expressions of the villagers as they realized the truth. Those images stayed with her. The village would never be the same. The church, once the heart of their community, had been revealed as a house of horrors. Yet, in its ruin, there was a kind of rebirth. The villagers, though scarred, began to rebuild their trust in each other. And Sophia, though weary, knew she had done what she had to do. The truth had finally come to light, and the church's dark chapter was closed forever.